In this tip of the day, I want to talk about something that I've been talking about for years, and that is piecing accuracy. All of the different things that come into play when we are trying to get our pieces in our quilt sewn together with the best possible accuracy. Now, I did a video on this quite a few years ago, so I thought I would break this down again and go into more detail, kind of an updated information. So this is going to be a few parts. This is part one. In this part, we're going to talk about our fabrics. That is the number one thing, of course, that affects our accuracy is how we choose our fabrics, how we treat our fabrics before we start the quilting process, and of course, how we put them together. So first off, fabric, if you purchase fabric right off the bolt at a quilt shop, it came straight from the fabric mill. At the fabric mill, the fabric is stretched while during the printing process. And then after the printing process, it gets rolled onto big rolls. From the rolls, it actually gets put on the bolt by a machine that double folds the fabric and then wraps it onto bolts. So from the start of the printing process until you purchase your fabric at the store, that fabric has not been treated or pressed or been exposed to any kind of water, steam, or heat. So even though your fabric looks really nice and flat right off the bolt, I would highly advise you to not start cutting it until you have given it a really good press. Ideally with a lot of steam. And the reason being, as I said before, the fabric is stretched in the beginning, and so those fibers need to realign themselves, and sometimes some fabrics will shrink a little bit, others will just kind of realign and get back into their original shape. Now, I love a good steam, so I wanted to mention my favorite irons are the Reliable irons. They are really good steam irons. The great thing about them is that you can have different temperatures on the sole plate, but the steam will still be high steam, low steam, whatever you want, no matter what the sole plate temperature is. So we carry the Velocity iron, and then also the Maven, which has a water tank, so you're not carrying the water in the iron. So that is my preference. Of course, you can pre-wash your fabrics. There are a lot of folks that like to pre-wash their fabrics before they start the quilting process, and that's a personal preference. However, if you pre-wash, you still want to iron your fabrics really nicely before you do any cutting. Now, some fabrics will shrink more than others, and that's where the quality comes in. It comes from what that original cloth is, the thread count of that base cloth that the fabric is that is printed before it's printed. So some of them, like I said, will shrink a little bit. Usually fabrics, if they shrink one way more so than the other, because fabric has stronger fibers going one way than the other. You probably recognize that when you rip fabric, that is easier to rip one way than the other. So always give it a press. Now, quality in your fabrics is also going to affect your accuracy in sewing. And so if you wanted to use maybe a fabric that is a little less quality than some of your other ones, which I have done multiple times, you still can do that. You just want to make sure to maybe pre-treat that fabric, maybe wash it so that the weave gets a little bit tighter before you use it with other higher quality fabrics. So if you want to pre-wash, like I said, you still have to press everything afterwards. Now, you can also pre-treat your fabric to get even better accuracy. And you can use starch, you can use best press. There's different levels of starches and pre-treatments you can apply to your fabrics to make them more stable, to make them a little bit stiffer so they're easier to work with, especially if you're doing any kind of cutting on the bias, working with triangles, or things like that. So that is what I prefer to do whenever I'm doing those kinds of cuts, and I know I'm going to be working with the fabric when it is cut on the bias. That's going to give me more stability and therefore more accuracy. Now I have done a whole video on using my starching process, and I actually went through a few different brands, and so you can try and you can watch the video and see what type of starch and heaviness you prefer. So Best Press is going to give you just a little bit of weight and a little bit of stability. The next up, I would say, is the Magic Quilting and Crafting Spray. So they're pretty similar, just a very light body. Another light body is the Magic Sizing. I prefer the Magic Sizing for most of mine. If you need extra, you can go as far as doing regular starch, or even if you want it even stiffer than that, Terreal Magic is even stiffer than that. But please go back and watch on my previous tip of the day for my starching process. It is easy and really can make a difference. Now, what if you're working with pre-cuts? Charm packs, layer cakes, jelly rolls. Those fabrics, as they come into the fabric companies or into the mills, they will not be pre-treated at all. They will not be pressed before they get cut. So they come right off those rolls and then they get cut into the shapes. So even though they look nice and flat and pretty accurate, always, always take them out of the pack and give each piece of fabric a good steam press before you start anything. And yes, I mean that too with jelly rolls or strips, 2.5-inch strips, 1.5-inch strips. And no, it takes a little bit more time, but you're gonna really like that you did that, because again, those fabrics are going to realign. So what happens with that, if you're working with squares, sometimes your squares will not end up squares after you have pressed them. So I also don't recommend pre-cuts that are especially squares or strips if you really do need to use the whole piece, because sometimes you will end up with something that's not a full square. But definitely give all of your pre-cuts a good press, or even some starch too. Now when you're starching, make sure you let it dry completely before you do any cutting, because it needs to be completely dry before you start cutting so that you'll get accurate pieces. Otherwise, they'll keep changing on you as you move through the process. So this is part one. I'm going to talk about the next things that come into the process of getting those accurate pieces as you sew, so your blocks will turn out right. So I'll see you next time.